Well, dairy is a double-edged sword. So I'm going to, I guess, indulge myself a little bit. I got this little book recently. So it's basically a report by the Medical Research Council. The Privy Council, I'll just hold it up so you can see the title there. So this was published in 1931. And what it is, studies of nutrition, the physique and health of 2 African tribes. And this is an absolutely fascinating book because what they did, they went, this was English scientists, they went to Africa, this was back in the late 20s, and they came across 2 tribes. So one of them was a chiefly carnivore tribe, which we know to be the Maasai. They consume a lot of meat and a lot of dairy. And they found an adjoining tribe called the Akakuyu, who was chiefly vegetarian. And there was a little bit of intermixing between these tribes by marriages and things like that. So genetically, they were fairly similar. So I'm going to read out just a summary of their results. So physical measurements showed that full-grown Maasai male is on average 5 inches taller and 23 pounds heavier than the full-grown male Kikuyu. And his muscular strength, as determined by the dynamometer, is 50% greater. Marked differences were found in the incidence of disease in the 2 tribes. Bony deformities, dental caries and anemia, pulmonary conditions and tropical ulcer being much more prevalent among the Akakuyu. On the other hand, intestinal stasis and rheumatoid arthritis were more common amongst the Maasai.
Oh, fascinating.
Now, so the take-home message, I guess, is that meat and dairy diet, on average, leads to you being far healthier, far stronger, far more robust than a vegetarian diet. But the interesting thing is about this intestinal stasis, constipation, and rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disease, being more common in the Maasai. And this comes back to 2 things. So have you ever heard of something called casomorphine?
Yes.
So this is a chemical. It's basically an opiate-like peptide that's found in dairy. And if anybody has ever prescribed morphine, when I was in medical school, we were taught that the hand that writes the script for an opiate also writes a script for a laxative. Why? Because opiates cause constipation. So this isn't very well known, but it is very obvious to a lot of my patients who are constipated that when they eliminate dairy from the diet, you're removing this constipatory effect of the casomorphine. So absolutely, dairy contributes to constipation. And I actually first learned this from Dr. David Unwin from the UK. So he was discussing with me his patient experience, and he had identified that in his patients as well. And this is what I was able to figure out mechanistically. Now, number 2, 80% of the protein fraction within dairy is something called casein. And casein can cross-react. It has cross-reactivity with gluten, which we know can be an autoimmune trigger. So there's increasing evidence that dairy in vulnerable individuals can trigger autoimmune issues, the likes of rheumatoid arthritis. And this is why many patients, when they eliminate gluten and dairy from their diet with autoimmune disease, they improve significantly. And I would also make the point that back in the 1920s, these Maasai weren't getting their milk from the supermarket. It wasn't pasteurized, it wasn't homogenized, it was natural milk straight from the cow. So, and it was A2. So people who think that you can get raw milk and A2 milk and that's going to avoid any potential adverse effects of dairy consumption, it's not borne out by the science. And having said that, it's science from 1931, but this is in my mind, it's very suggestive. And when we have a look at the mechanisms, we do see that molecularly there is cross-reactivity between casein and between gluten. And when we have a look at constipation, we know that casomorphine and opiate-type peptide is absolutely found in dairy. So certainly we've got some epidemiological evidence and we've got mechanistic data to back it up.
My clients, a lot of them have autoimmune illness and they have a lot of gut issues. So some of them really want to add back dairy and they'll start with the raw dairies and they still cannot tolerate it. So I would say majority of my clients, while they would love to consume dairy, it doesn't matter how high of quality dairy is, they cannot tolerate it. So I would say in my practice, it's the same thing.
Some dairy is much better tolerated. So fermented dairy,
Yes.
and some of your listeners are probably going to be familiar with the autoimmune protocol diet, AIP diet, and they have understood quite well that fermented dairy is better tolerated. It's not perfectly tolerated in everybody, but yogurt is basically the go-to. But the thing you have to be aware of is that if you have a look at the ingredients label on a lot of Greek yogurts now, they'll have their ingredients and then they'll have added milk solids. So after the fermentation process, which has actually made these proteins and stuff a little bit less reactive, then they go and add in a whack of milk solid again that hasn't had the benefit of that fermentation, and that then reintroduces the immunogenicity to it. So what I advise to my patients, and interestingly enough, one of my patients actually educated me on this, so you can actually never stop learning from your patients, is that check the yogurt, make sure that it doesn't have any added milk solids, and if it's tolerated, it's tolerated. If it's not, unfortunately, it's not. But that's the safest place and the first place that you go for with dairy.